This is We the Sales Engineers Podcast, show 33.
Welcome to We the SEs Podcast, the show for sales engineers by sales engineers with your host, Ramsey Majaba.
Did you know that every single person in my household is actually sick right now? Which is why you're hearing my voice instead of my wife's. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, SE Nation. Thanks for coming back. Thank you for being here. I do apologize if I do sound a bit stuffy or weird. It's because I am. It's been a rough week. But this was one good interview. And I really wanted to give Neil, my guest today, the credit that he's due. So I was planning on doing this short, hey, I'm sick. Forget about the intro and outro, but Neil deserves better. So here I am trying to speak very well and very eloquently out of my nose. Today's conversation, we just talked about so many different things, which is why it's a little bit of a longer show. And we talked about, we talked about introverts versus extroverts, sales engineering training, the pillars of sales engineering, improv, mastering solutions, what's next for sales engineers, and pros and cons of being an SE manager. So we covered a wide spectrum of topics, and Neil has a lot of information. He's been doing this for a long time. He's also a sales engineer manager, so he's actually able to speak from experience about all of this. And this was a fun conversation. It was just fun to have Neil on, going back and forth. So I hope you guys enjoy it. And I don't have any housekeeping because really I can't breathe. So let's move on to the show. Hey, Neil, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ramsey, thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. And maybe we can give a brief overview to everyone listening about who you are, what your experience is before we get started.
Sure, I'll do that. So I started off like a lot of sales engineers, not planning to get into sales engineering. I was a developer, building Microsoft technologies, doing a lot of different things within development. I got into web development, ended up parlaying that into a brief career as an e-commerce developer. I was actually involved in the first website for Target.com back in 1999. And it was while I was there that I learned about the role of sales engineering. And it was a little bit by accident because the contracting firm that I was working for on behalf of Target, long story short, they were about to go out of business and everybody knew it. So I was looking for a new opportunity, and the vendor that I'd been working with, ATG, or also known as Art Technology Group, we're looking for a sales engineer, and it looked like an interesting role, especially for someone like me who likes to talk as well as likes to do technical things. So it felt like a best of both worlds opportunity. And so once I joined them in 2001, frankly, I've never looked back.
So you moved to, you were a customer of that company, and you moved to basically the company who was selling to your vendor.
Correct. Yeah. So ATG had, way back before Amazon and before they brought it back in-house, Target.com they started with IBM's old net.commerce, and then they went to ATG the next year because the IBM solution wasn't working for them at the time. So yeah, it was I actually had about a year and a half of experience utilizing the solution. So making the transition to sales engineer was pretty easy for me because I already knew the technology really well.
Did you know what sales engineering was before you moved into the role?
Nope, didn't have any idea. I literally just it talked about being able to be technical, but it also talked about speaking with customers. And that just, once I saw that, it fascinated me. And yeah, I didn't even know the role existed or what it was called until ATG approached me about it.
I do have a quick question that's not related to, we'll get into my next more important question, but this one. Are you an introvert or an extrovert?
I have done a few of the Myers-Briggs tests, and based on the Myers-Briggs definition, I am absolutely positively an extrovert. So meaning that I draw my energy from other people. And so the way I like to describe it is, there are people who can't wait to get out of the party, and I'm the person who's sad that the party's over. So, I don't think that means necessarily that introverts or extroverts do better at this role, for example. I just think that it's understanding where they draw their energy from. Introversion in the Myers-Briggs sense simply means that you draw it from within, which is great. It's just that those people tend to have to recharge at various lengths afterwards. So I think that introversion and extroversion both bring advantages to the sales engineering role. It's just knowing how to manage it. So for me, I have to learn how to recharge and be by myself and not always try to be the life of the party. Whereas an introvert just needs to know their limits as far as, how long they can present or when they need time to recharge.
Yeah. So I'm an introvert.
I'm not shocked.
Yeah. Why is that?
Our brief conversations, you strike me as a person who's very focused. You're very internally driven. And those are the kind of people who tend to be introverted because, again, you don't need outside stimulus to do what you're going to do. You just do it. But the challenge is that saps you of energy. And so it's, those people tend to recharge. I just got the sense based on, obviously what you're doing and the kind of work that you've done that's probably the case. So I'm not surprised that you said that.
All right. Cool. I just wanted to let people know that I'm an introvert and you're an extrovert and we're both good at our jobs being sales engineers. So
that's true.
And it could be a combination of both. I'm an introvert who knows how to talk to people. You're an extrovert who knows how to sit behind a desk and work on the demo.
Sometimes.
Yeah, it does get hard. Sometimes it's a challenge if I don't have a meeting set up, it's a challenge to just get myself up and go visit a customer just for the sake of visiting them.
Sure.
But we get over that. All right. So you went into a new SE role. Did you receive any training on how to be an SE?
I did not. Well, let me rephrase that. We didn't do training per se, but the team did gather on a regular basis. And at the time, ATG was about to undergo a massive transformation. They were about to drop from 1,200 people down to 300, and so that took a couple years to do. But when I first started, the one thing they did do was the team met on a regular basis. And so in lieu of formalized training, when I started, we had a lot of personal interaction. So it was a lot of, there wasn't anything structured or formalized. There was no curriculum per se, but I certainly did. I was paired up with other good sales engineers who did some coaching with me. But it certainly wasn't as structured as it could have been. It was funny. Years later, we had a woman join the organization through an acquisition, and she was the first person who actually took SE development seriously, and the results were tremendous. So having been through both basically in my career, I can tell you that I assume that the latter or the former is how most sales engineers learn the trade is basically through oral tradition handed down from generation to generation as opposed to some kind of curriculum.
Yeah, well, that only works if you're co-located with your other teammates. So were you co-located in the same spot, or were you geographically dispersed?
Oh, we were dispersed for sure.
Okay.
And we did find ways to overcome that through communication, and a lot of times the sales engineer, the person I was paired with, would end up in the Twin Cities where I live. I live in Minnesota for the listeners, and so he would come up to Minnesota for meetings, and we would work and exchange videos. So we did our best to overcome the geographic limitations. Obviously, if we had all been in the same spot, that would have worked a lot better and a lot faster.
So what do you mean by you were paired with you were paired with an SE or an account manager?
Sorry, from a training perspective, I was paired with an SE. So
Okay.
to help me learn the ropes, but also to kind of give the thumbs up when they thought I was ready to actually present in front of a customer.
Okay, so kind of like a mentor position, or
Yeah,
okay.
That's for sure.
Let's just say that for today's sake. So when that lady actually came in and implemented the sales training, the SE training, what difference did it make to you personally and the organization?
So on a personal level, it was it came in a good time in my career personally, because I feel like that a lot of us in the organization had plateaued. we had just had a manager who was a great manager, but he was more of the rock star SE style. So he didn't really coach or mentor as much as like have contests to see who was the best. For example, one of us would develop an extension for ATG and say, hey, we did this for a customer, and we would send it around to everybody because it's what we did. We shared code and our ideas. And then 2 hours later, the boss would chime in and say, hey, that's great. Here's something I did a while back, and implicitly saying it was better than yours, and then giving it to us. So, I mean, he wasn't mean about it. He was that's just how he did things. But Lisa Butler was her name. She came in, and she was not as technically strong as we were, which is fine because you didn't have to be. Her strength was in the business skills. So it really took our entire team to the next level. And also too, from a personal growth perspective, really helped me understand more about the consultative nature of the sale, helping us understand the trusted advisor, for lack of a better term, the trusted advisor potential of the sales engineer. And also too, I think the big thing is that she helped us understand that in the best sales organizations, the SE is a peer to the sales rep. The SE is not subordinate to the sales rep, and that they should, as much as possible, have, I won't say equal, but have strong influence on how the deal is run, what happens in the deal, how to work with the customer. So I think, and also too, she was great about teaching us presentation skills. I mean, simple things like don't leave your keys in your pocket when you present, and make eye contact, and don't be so eager to answer questions. Ask a clarifying question. Make sure you understand the question before you answer it. Get the context, kind of thing. So a lot of those little skills were things that she instilled in the team, and we all benefited from it. The team performance went up. The alignment between the SEs and the opportunities increased, and certainly what she taught was a huge benefit to me when I then became a manager and had my own team.
I do have a question about the keys in the pocket. You mentioned it a couple of times to me personally, and
Sure.
I've never heard that tip before. Can you elaborate a little bit more on why it's bad to leave your keys in your pocket?
So it's keys in the pocket, change in the pocket. I think it has to do with the idea of being professional and eliminating distractions, not just for the audience, but for yourself. And I think that the stereotype and the stigma on technical SEs, especially in a software organization or a services organization, is that they're the nerdy guys who have the product knowledge, but they're not an integral part of the sales opportunity. They're just there as a sideshow to help the sales rep. And so they generally tend to be, like, for example, they tend to come in, you always know who the sales engineer is, or at least you used to be able to know that, because they were the ones that didn't wear a tie, because none of them wore ties before they became sales engineers. Or they tend to come in with a backpack instead of a satchel, right? Which I realize that's kind of a broad generalization, but it's just the idea of taking the sales engineering role seriously as a professional in the room, which I think also speaks to, their status as being a partner with the sales rep, and not just being a person brought in to do something. So, and of course, with people like that, they tend to be so focused on the technology and on answering questions that they forget about things like turning your phone off, or eliminating all the basic distractions that you would have in a meeting. So I always talk about keys in pockets, because that to me resonates, and I was probably the worst violator of that. And to this day, when I go into a meeting, I take my keys and put them in my satchel or my bag before I start talking.
Okay, so the good news about this is that, and this is something we're going to talk about later about next steps for SEs, but if an SE wants to become a sales guy, all he has to do is trade it in his bag for a satchel. Is that accurate?
Well, it's a little more than that, but yeah, you gotta train the backpack for a satchel, preferably a leather one.
Okay, all right. So You mentioned that you worked on like an SE training curriculum for your company, or like for, I guess, for yourself, trying to understand what SEs should be doing. Could you share a little bit of what that curriculum would be?
Oh, sure. So when you're talking about sales engineers and what makes a good sales engineer, right? That's the bottom line question. I there's a lot of different, philosophies and approaches to this, and they're all obviously very good, and they help. What I narrowed it down to was three areas that makes a good sales engineer. The first one, of course, is, and this is obvious, is solution mastery. You got to know your solution cold.
Yep.
And it's not just good enough to know your solution. You've got to know that solution in the context of its ecosystem. So, for example, commerce is the one I'm most familiar with. It's not enough today just to know about the deep dive on your solution. You have to understand how it integrates with PIM solutions or OMSs, or especially now in the era of headless commerce, how you integrate with a DX or CMS system, and you have to understand how that works. So you have to broaden your mastery of not just the product, but also the other products that they may connect to at some point. You certainly have to have a passion for not just what you're doing, but also for the ecosystem. So it's solution mastery. And the second one is what I call consulting skills. I used to call them soft skills, or if you are a fan of the movie Office Space, they're people skills, right? So consulting skills, it's the idea of the things I talked about earlier, which was the keys and pockets. So personal presence. How do you build empathy and trust with a customer? How do you manage a meeting? Learning to be a little more sales oriented. And I think that's always a challenge for technical people, because developers and techies pride themselves on not being persuaded by sales, which is absolutely not true. They're just sold a different way than other people. But it's the idea of being able to, instead of always, saying exactly what's on your mind, being able to cast that in a positive light, or to be able to say that in a way that's not quite as offensive as you normally would if you were just sitting around with beers or coffee talking about it with your peers. The other thing too that is becoming more important is the ability to write, or the ability to take information from a source, like a database of answers, and being able to put together RFPs and written responses to things. Writing skills are very important because it has to do with impressions. So solution mastery, consulting skills, and then also one thing that I believe in that doesn't get talked about a lot from other people is the ability to improvise. So we're all familiar with improv comedy, at least most people are. If you've seen Whose Line Is It Anyway, or shows like that, improv is a fantastic skill. It's something that the good SEs develop instinctively, but it is absolutely something that can be taught. And it's the whole idea of, the foundation of improv comedy is always being open to the suggestion, right? So it's the yes and. Instead of saying no to something, you say yes, or you are positive about it, but then you tailor it or move it back to the direction you want it to go. And that has to do with, when you're in a situation in sales, you have to wear multiple hats in some cases. You have to handle objections. You have to adapt to the customer situation. Sales engineers are asked to play a lot of roles sometimes in a sales cycle. They're incredibly versatile and can do that. And that has to do with improvisation. So I think those three things, solution mastery, consulting skills, and improvisation, are the things that make a good sales engineer. So once you have that foundation, then it's a matter of, finding the way of teaching those things to your organization.
I do have a question about the yes and thing. Pretty much I agree with everything you said. The yes and, I witnessed it happening to me, and it pissed me off. Where I say something, and then so we were in a sales training. I say something, and the response is yes and then he says something completely different that contradicts what I just said.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a literal interpretation of yes and.
Okay. So I want to dig deep
Because
into that. Like, what do you mean by yes and? Because in the end, he fixed it, and like I respected his opinion because he kind of answered all my questions. But that yes and part was always confusing to me. It's like I say something, he says yes and, but then he says something opposite, and I'm like, what happened here? You just agreed with me, and then you disagreed. So could you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
yeah, right. I think improvisation is different than being a politician, because being a politician, and especially in the United States, right? The rule they teach politicians is whenever you're asked a question by the media, don't answer the question that they asked you, answer the question that you wish they asked you, right?
Yes.
And so that explains why American politicians say some of the things they say. But when it comes to improvisation, you're not. Yes, and is a concept. You actually hear that sometimes in an improv skit, but if the big thing, it's what's more important than the yes and is the fact that they're not saying no. So when you watch an improv skit, you know how what's the one skit where the audience will call out some occupation or they'll call out something, and then the actors on stage will incorporate that into their dialogue. And a lot of times, and then there's always the game where halfway through they'll change it, right? They'll introduce some other topic. So in that scene, they have to stop where they're at, and then the very next sentence continue the exact same scene with a whole different premise.
Like, are you talking about Whose Line?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, yeah, Whose Line Is It Anyway is fantastic for that. But there's comedy clubs, and I'll talk about that in a second. About there's a lot of clubs in the United States that actually have corporate trainings they do for that. But it's the idea of not saying no. So when something comes up, instead of just shutting it down and saying, nope, doesn't work, it's the idea of how do I take that and pivot that in the direction that it needs to go. So, for example, if a customer comes up with a ridiculous idea, like, for example, you're selling a solution that does online marketing, and a well-meaning person in the room says, well, I wonder if this thing could launch the space shuttle. Right, which is completely ridiculous, but your job is to say, something like, well, actually the technology is great and it could, and then finding ways to steer that back to saying a very polite way of saying that's probably not the best way to use the technology. So that's really what yes and is. It's being able to take suggestions and move them where they need to go or where they should go, and it also sometimes means from an SE perspective, it means wearing different hats. I can't tell you the number of times in my career that I've been asked to write marketing pieces because we needed something for this particular client. And this was years ago, back when that was a little more important, but we needed something for a client and nothing existed. And we couldn't wait for marketing to make a budget for it and spend 6 weeks doing it. So I actually did that once for a prospect. So it means a couple of things, but definitely does not mean what you just said, because just flat out contradiction, because then you'd be a politician.
Okay. All right. So when you're saying the yes and, it's a concept. You don't actually have to say the words yes and. You just have to take what they gave you and use it to help them understand what you're actually trying to say.
Correct.
All right. So I want to go back to solution mastery, which is basically one thing we don't talk about on this show because we take it for granted. Like, if you want to be an SE, you have to be the E part, which is understand your product. But let's take my situation, and I do that because I'm selfish and I want to learn more about how I can help myself.
Oh, sure.
I'm a generalist SE. That's what they call me. So I have a bunch of different products, and each one has a bunch of different things that it would do that are unrelated to, like, it can do A, B, and C. A and B are not related. So being a generalist SE in most companies is very hard to become solution master.
Right.
So I guess my question would be, how do I become a good sales engineer knowing that I have this limitation ahead of me?
So that's interesting. So let me just clarify. So you're saying that you have to know so many things about the solution set that you sell that you feel like it's not possible to I mean, what you're saying is it requires going really deep in one of those solutions in order to be considered a master in that?
Yeah, so like I have 10 different products, and as an example, and each one does 10 different things or 100 different things, whatever it is.
Right.
So I'm not, I might be an expert in one or two, but I will not be able to answer in-depth questions about everything.
Okay.
But
I see
keep
what you're
in mind, I want to just so most companies that have that have either subject matter experts in specific things or consultant engineers on top of those to assist. And their job is to focus on one product and one technology.
Oh, interesting.
Right.
Okay.
So I guess I don't know if you want to answer that question, but we can have this discussion.
Oh well, no. I think that's interesting you bring it up, and I think that honestly, I think that most and this is kind of a related topic. The role of the SC, I think, is changing over time, and as part of that, they have to become more consultative. And I think that, frankly, they do have to know more. I think that the difference in your case, and again, this is just after hearing what you're asking me. My instinct would be that, obviously, you want to know as much as possible about everything. And a lot of SEs, frankly, take that as a challenge. Like, well, you know what? You want me to know 100 things about 100 products? Well, darn it, I'm going to do it, right? So there are some who are motivated in that way. But I think that, more practically speaking, I think that sometimes sales engineers need to understand that ultimately they're trying to please their customers. And so, sometimes I think sales engineers tend to overestimate the amount of mastery that they actually have to have in order to be successful. And I don't think that that's a tension that I necessarily want to dissuade from sales engineers, because they're always being driven to be better at what they do and to know more and to be more knowledgeable. But at the same time, customer expectations are, if you can speak intelligently about a solution, and even if you are able to bring in other resources to get into deeper dives, I think you find that the level of mastery that's required to be effective in a sales cycle and to exceed customer expectations, I think is probably a little less than you might think. So, that would be my tack is understand, without knowing the actual solutions themselves. I feel like that you're, maybe it's just a case of understanding. Maybe you don't go, all the way to the bottom. But, you're not at 10,000 feet, but you're not at the 1 foot level. Maybe you focus on being 1,000 feet, right? So you get a little more mastery than you typically would need. And I think that's always a good strategy too. Is always know a little more than you need to. It's a lot of work, obviously, and I think it's difficult to do that when you're trying to build demos and close deals and help customers to have the time to do that. But I just think that the you can go as deep as you need to, but I also think that you need to just go. Don't overestimate what customers are expecting from you in that. And that's kind of that's my off the cuff answer here. And obviously there's probably more detail to that, but I think that's how I would approach that. Because if you look at the world today, sales engineers are really consultants. They're required to have at least some basic understanding of the ecosystem, like I said, that a product exists in. So if you demonstrate a decent level of understanding of the ecosystem and are able to bring in experts to complement you, then I don't think that hinders you at all. I think that helps you.
I agree with that. Well, that's a very good answer for someone who's never thought about this specific situation. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that.
I've been thinking about this for a long time, actually. And what I've come up with, and we can have this discussion right now, is that at a minimum, what I need to know is what problems my products solve.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that if I'm going and having a conversation with a customer, and I use this more for like qualification than discovery.
Sure.
I can ask the questions that will allow the customer to see the value of my product and will want to have a discovery call. At which point I can leverage the experts to come in to have that discussion.
Yeah, and you bring a good point too that I think is also very important, and it has to do with the consulting skills. It's the listening aspect, right? Sales engineers as a group tend to be very eager to please because they want to show off their technical skills and how smart they are. Which, that's, the history of development and technology has to do with that basically. But listening to what the customer is looking for and really getting to know the question, asking the question behind the question, really delving into not just the obvious surface things, but getting into the details of why things are happening a certain way. Because, as we know, behind every sales opportunity, there's some kind of internal political situation going on at the company, or some kind of power struggle, or some kind of personal investment that has nothing to do with the technology. And only by listening and asking those questions do you get to that point. And there's the old saying that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's a statement about relationships, but I think it also applies to business relationships.
I've never heard that before. Good to know. It makes sense. So, all right, for solution mastery, people can actually master the solution by just doing it. We're all engineers. We all went to university, at least most of us.
Right.
Are educated, so we know how to sit down and study and learn something. You just sit down and do it. But for the consulting skills, I've never actually seen a process of learning those. Like, you read a lot of books, you watch a lot of YouTube videos, whatever. But how can you actually get better at those? How do you know what you need to work on?
So I think that, that's a great question. Short of having somebody who can tell you that, I think there are, especially now for sales engineers, there are some more resources out there than there used to be. There are resources, by a few vendors who've done books about how to do great demos. And the books usually aren't about doing a demo per se. It's about understanding the customer's needs and using learning consulting skills or teaching those skills as a way of understanding how to do a great demo. So it's kind of a backdoor way of teaching it. In addition, and I'll gladly promote John Kerr's book, Trusted Advisor Sales Engineer. For those who haven't had that kind of training, I've just started reading the book, and I got to the math equation part. And I can tell you that kind of thing is important because one of the big things that he stresses is they call it intimacy. So putting yourself in the customer's shoes. That type of mindset, I think, helps. But generally, it's a good question, is how do you teach somebody how to be empathetic? How do you teach them to listen and not talk? And I think that a lot of times, there are a lot of YouTube videos and a lot of online resources you can read and videos to watch and stuff. But I think that, obviously, if you can get into a situation where there's somebody who can teach you that, and everybody learns differently, right? So one style of teaching is not going to work for somebody, but it'll work for somebody else. And I think it's finding, if you can't find resources for that you can work with, then I think it's important to find a mentor or multiple mentors who can walk you through that. So, having debriefs after your calls, and obviously if it's somebody who's in the room with you, that's even better. But having somebody you can talk to about what you did in the meeting and asking for tips, tricks, and advice, and someone who will push, be better at certain things. For example, I've probably said a lot on this call. I feel like I have, even though maybe I haven't. But that's one of those easy ones that people fall victim to is filling in blank spots in conversations with throwaway words like and yeah and
I say so every time I want to ask a question. So you did this. So
Yeah.
now I just did it right now, and now I said
Right.
it, and people are aware of it. So let's do a little bit of a competition. How about you guys count how many so's and ums we say in this interview?
Great. We're all in trouble.
Just don't tell me what the number is. Tell me how many ums, not how many so's. All right.
Oh, man.
There's all right as well. Next section. At SE. Now I'm finding it very hard to talk. I'm very self-conscious.
I know, me too. I'm going to be doing that the whole time.
We should have done this. At SE, he's a solution master. He knows all the consulting skills, and he's good at improv. What is next for the sales engineer?
So there you go. I said so. There you go. Perfect.
You're
I
welcome.
had the same. So we're both doing that. So I think that the next level from there. Okay, so it depends on a couple things. First of all, there's this whole topic of going into leadership. Okay, and I'm not going to necessarily talk about that at this moment. But obviously, when you talk about a career path for a sales engineer, sales engineering tends to be one of those things where people stay in it for a long time because, frankly, if you're in a good company that's doing well, you're making money. And as much as people don't want to admit that that's one of the reasons to stick around at a company, that absolutely is. If you're selling a great solution and you've got good reps and they're successful and you're making your quota or exceeding your quota and getting your bonuses all the time, sales engineers tend to stick around for a long time. But when you start talking about the next level, regardless of whether you want to go into leadership, SE leadership or not, I would say that the next level as far as what to do has to do with really understanding and getting more involved with the sales process. What I mean by that is when you're obviously when you learn the skills of being an SE and the consulting skills, generally most companies have requirements for SEs to log their activity in some way, shape, or form. A lot of companies enforce using an SFA, so Salesforce is the most common one, or whatever it is.
What does SFA stand for?
Salesforce automation tool. So like Salesforce.com or NetSuite. So they have to log their activity somewhere.
Okay.
So that's a big part of the sales process. I actually am a big fan of sales engineers using Salesforce.com or using the same tools that the reps use, because I think, again, from looking at it from a partnership perspective, you want that SE to be as knowledgeable about the deal as the sales rep. And listen, I've been at companies where when there's a deal going down and we're in the middle of an active pursuit, the sales manager will call me and ask me what's actually going on in the deal, because he knows he's going to get a story from the sales rep potentially, but he knows he's going to get an honest assessment from the sales engineer. So I think that's important. So I think that moving into more of that sales management, understanding how the resources are aligned with the opportunities, I think that's the next level you get to, because that makes you more valuable. And frankly, it makes you more attractive to sales reps, because they understand that besides having a mastery of the solution and of the ecosystem, being able to speak intelligently and build rapport with customers, you understand how sales works. And I think there's a lot of, we could talk forever, have a whole show about the relationship between sales reps and sales engineers. And I think that in my experience, my most successful SE sales relationships have been ones where they believed that I understood how the sales process worked, and that I was moving to help close deals. I wasn't being smarmy or salesy, and I wasn't being dishonest, and I wasn't being unethical in any way, shape, or form, but I just understood how the process worked and was willing to work with them. So I think that's what I would say in general. That's the next level. I mean, a sales engineer can stick around in their job forever if they want, if they'll be allowed to. I can tell you that when I was at ATG, I think I went through 4 different sales VPs and 3 different sales methodologies and countless sales reps. We were the consistent theme in the company. But I think if you want to move to that next level, I think that understanding and being more integral in the sales process is probably that next step, regardless of what direction you take your career after that.
So there you go. So when we talk about Salesforce, I can't imagine an SE doing his role without using you call SFA, I call CRM, without using it, just because it's convenient. Like, I have all the information that I need about all the deals that my sales guy is working on right there. So if I need to figure out what I need to do, I can look at the opportunities and decide. The other option would be to actually talk to the sales guy, and there goes half of my day, because salespeople like to talk. At least that's a generalization.
Yeah, and I think that more so than ever, sales engineers are being more diligent about putting things. And you're right, SFA, CRM, it's the same. We're talking about the same technology. So I'll use your terminology.
No, I learned something new, so I'm happy to use SFA.
Oh, sure. Well, I'll just say Salesforce, because that's the one I like to use, and I've used the last couple of companies. But you'll find that the sales engineers tend to enter things in Salesforce long before the reps do.
Yes.
I also think that in a backwards way, it kind of keeps the reps accountable, because their managers are pushing for the reps to use Salesforce, and sales reps even to this day tend to be a little resistant, because it's perceived as busy work and administrative work. But the fact is, it helps a lot of people, including the sales engineers. So I know that there are some SCs who still resist that, because for the same reason that sales reps resist it, is because it's perceived as busy work. But like you understand the value that brings, and so it's a lot easier to put the work in to keep it updated and to use it as the resource it's supposed to be.
All right, so all right, crap. I keep saying so. So all right, I'm gonna have to edit this out.
Let's just roll with it.
All right, let's roll with it. This is real, people. I'm very self-conscious. This is what SEs go through.
That's right.
Let's say an SE wants to become a manager beyond just doing like the sales management stuff. They can go into marketing. They can go into sales, but we never talked about going into a management position. And you've done that. So
yes,
what does an SE need to do to become an SE manager?
This is a fascinating topic, because we get into, and of course this is a sports analogy, but we get into the analogy of coaches and players. So historically in professional sports, the star players generally don't make good coaches. We've seen a few examples in history. So, for example, for the NBA, Larry Bird is a rare example of a star player who turned out to be a pretty good coach, and he coached for a while with the Indiana Pacers. But typically, it doesn't work out. You see this especially when it comes to a star salesperson being promoted into a sales management role. That's almost a way to end their careers, I think, because the fundamental challenge is that the skills that make you a star contributor generally aren't the same skills that make you a great manager. And so I think that if somebody is looking to be, this is going to sound counterintuitive, but if you're looking to be a manager, I think that if you consider yourself an average or above average sales engineer, you're probably the best candidate to be a manager, because you have an understanding of what it takes to be good, and you're surrounded by greatness. You've seen it in others. You understand it, and it gives you more of the ability to coach. If you look at, going back to the sports analogy, Bill Belichick, the head coach of the New England Patriots, I don't believe the man ever actually played football at a high level, or ever. But he understands the game, and obviously the results of the New England Patriots speak for themselves. And that's the story of a lot of great head coaches in American football. I'm sure Canadian football is probably the same way, but the head coaches weren't always star players. And in fact, I think, and for the American audience, we all know the story of Mike Singletary, who was a fantastic linebacker for the Chicago Bears, and he was made the head coach of the San Francisco 49ers, and he did horribly. So being a star player doesn't make it. So I think that if you're a star SE, keep being a star SE. But if you maybe don't consider yourself that, you think you're good, but you think you can contribute as a sales as a manager or a leader, I think those are the best candidates. And I think that what it comes down to is coaching. Do you have the desire and the ability to coach other people to be successful? Because an SE manager at its heart is a player coach. They can still play when they have to. They can still create presentations, and many times they have to. They're going to be overseeing sales engineers, and they may be called upon to do a final presentation for a really, really big client or someone who's really busy. So they have to still be able to play, but primarily they coach. Their job is to enable their team to be successful, give them the tools to be successful, and then get out of their way. So if that's a player coach, if someone wants to be a player coach, they would make a great candidate for being an SE manager.
Can I make a small distinction for the star SE? My opinion, no facts to back it up, is that if you're a star SE and you know what it took to get you to become a star SE, like you weren't a star SE from day one, you actually had to work on it to get there, then I think you might be a good coach because you actually know what you had to do to get there. So you must be very cerebral. Whereas if you're just like, you walked in and now you're a star SE and you have no idea why, you just did it right, and you never analyzed why, then you might not be able to actually help other people get to where you got. Was that something you would disagree with?
I think that can be true. The challenge that I would caution anybody in that spot is that when you're a star SE, when challenges or issues come up, your tendency is to just do it yourself, right? So here's an example. You have you're leading a team and one of your SEs has a huge presentation at a client and they're struggling for some reason. Well, instead of coaching and training them and helping them get better, you just jump in and start doing stuff for them. So like, for example, you'll build their code for them, or you'll change their presentation for them, or sometimes you'll just go on site and do it yourself. The challenge with being a star is that you will, unless you're careful, unless you're thoughtful, like you said, stars will always rely on their star skills to just do things, and they'll end up doing a lot of the work themselves instead of enabling their team. And that's not fair to either. And I've seen examples of this in the SE world. I've seen examples of this in other companies, even things that aren't anything related to do with e-commerce or in technology per se. But I think that's the distinction. If that person is capable of resisting the urge to always want to jump in and take over and be the star, then yeah, I think they can be a successful SE manager. Again, that's something you have to watch, and whoever was leading that person would have to be aware of that and really work with that SE manager to ensure that they didn't fall back into the star syndrome and just jump in and fix things.
Yeah, so we've had this similar situation with a sales director who was a salesperson and got promoted to sales director, and pretty much everybody underneath him don't actually have to do anything because he takes over whenever he shows up. So yeah, that I agree with that.
The stories we could tell about star sales. In fact, I think of one example in one of my companies. The star sales rep in the region got promoted to manager, and it was a categorical disaster. Thankfully, that salesperson left after about 18 months, but that 18 months was hell for everybody involved.
Yeah. Okay. And so what is the dark side of being a sales engineer manager that nobody ever talks about?
The dark side.
How much paperwork do you have to do?
Come to the dark side. We have candy. So I would say that the paperwork. I mean, there's administrative work to do. Sure. I mean, the dark side. I think for somebody who's not. I guess there's a couple of them. I would say the first one is you have to hire and fire. So one of the toughest things I've ever had to do was fire an SE who wasn't performing. And this is a case of a person that we got through an acquisition, and he was not doing well. There was a lot of complaints from the field. And so we put him on a performance plan, which, by the way, a hint to anybody who's put on a performance plan, they're about to fire you, get out. don't even wait for the performance plan to be done. But in this case here, we put the gentleman on a performance plan, probably knowing that he wasn't going to make it. And it had nothing to do with this person's ability and skill. He just wasn't a good fit for what we were trying to accomplish. He absolutely was a very talented presenter, frankly, one of the best speakers I've ever worked with ever in any context. It's just that he didn't have a passion for the solution and enough to fuel greater understanding of it to make it more effective. And so I had to, the hardest thing I had to do was let somebody go. And I'll tell you what, though, a side story on that situation, it was a big relief to him. He was thankful that he got let go because he felt like he was spinning his wheels and he knew that he wasn't doing well and that he wasn't happy. And so since that, he immediately got another role somewhere, and he's been a successful consultant for many, many years after that. So the story didn't end poorly for him in that case. But still, hiring and firing is tough. I think that the other thing that I would say is probably more of the dark side is being exposed to and being involved in the nuts and bolts of the sales organization. Because when you're an SE manager, generally you're working with the sales managers, your peers on the sales side. So whether it's regional or national or global, you are now being exposed to the nitty gritty of the numbers, and if the region's not making quota, and you're being pressured to make decisions about things, you're being pressured to align resources in ways that you don't agree with. I can tell you, for my time as a manager, I had knockdown, drag out shouting matches with a regional sales manager over disagreements about alignment and philosophy and about the timing of deals and about involvement. It was legendary to some degree. Ironically, he and I are great friends now. We learned how to work with each other as a result of that. But I think that for an SE who's more of a technical background, who's used to just solving problems and getting things done, when you get exposed to that political world of the sales organization and understanding how things are orchestrated behind the scenes and what management's saying and hearing about things that you can't talk about with your team, I think that's probably, I want to say the dark side, but it's the part that it is not as attractive unless you're open-minded and willing to work in that world.
Let's end it on a good note then. What is so much fun? Is there anything fun about being a sales engineer and manager?
Oh, it's if you like to coach, I can't, I coach, I've coached fast pitch softball for years. And so, coaching is something that I enjoy doing. There's nothing more satisfying than helping a team be successful, to work with them and then see them put that advice into practice, and then watching them actually grow and make more money as a result of the coaching you've given them. And then it's always gratifying to see what they've done, what they do afterwards. And you never want a salesperson, you never want an SE to leave, but when they leave, you always know they're aspiring to greater things. I think of the team that I managed at ATG, and I can tell you that there's consulting practice leads, there's VPs of sales, there's CTOs, there's consulting managers. I'm really proud of what they have achieved since then. And, I would like to think that maybe I had a small part in helping them achieve those goals. So the coaching aspect and watching your team grow, to me, that's my favorite part of it.
So my former manager, he recently left the company, but he was pretty much the best manager I've ever had, and NSE manager. And it was just like there wasn't anything like he tried to enforce or anything, but just having conversations with the guy, that he cared. And I don't know if this is something just common with sales engineering team, maybe because as sales engineers, we have to know how to work with people more than regular engineers. But I find sales engineer managers are better to work with than regular managers. That's just my feeling about it.
Yeah, I'll agree with you. The the best manager I ever had in my entire career was my sales engineering manager.
All right. So now that we are starting to tear up, how about we move on to the not so fire round?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Let's move on to the not so fire round, which is basically 4 questions I ask most of my guests,
All right.
and you take your time answering them because it's not so fire round.
Okay.
I came up with it all by myself. All right. Other than a notebook and a pen, what is an essential tool that an SE should be using?
Oh, I would say a tablet.
Why?
Not a phone, not a laptop. I think a tablet because they're versatile and you can actually use a tablet to write notes. And I think that it just makes capturing thoughts and things easier than it looks more professional on a phone, but it's not a giant clunky laptop.
Okay. I don't enjoy using tablets just because I've never been able to figure out how to write on them properly.
Right.
Yeah, I sound like a very techie person right now. All right. Is there a book or resource that every sales engineer should be exposed to?
Well, there's 2 of them. One is a recent book that I've read, and it's not Trusted Advisor, although I do recommend that book. It's called Sales Differentiation. It's by a guy named Lee Salz, and I think that that book talks about how it's not just what you sell, but how you sell it that makes you different. And I think there's great advice for sales engineers in there. I think they can look through the sales oriented discussion and see value from that. The other book, you're going to laugh at this, the other book that I would recommend reading is called Selling Air. It's an obscure book that was written many, many years ago. I actually bought it for my my SE team as a gift for Christmas a couple of years ago. But it's basically a fictional story about being a sales engineer in the .com era. It's actually quite fascinating, especially when you read it now. When you read it now, I mean, it hasn't aged that well, but the fact is, some of the things that we deal with as SCs today haven't changed in 15, 20 years.
So it's a classic.
I think it is. Good luck finding it.
Okay. Well, if I find it, I'll put a link to it. If I find it
Thank
on
you.
Amazon, I'll put a link to it.
Okay.
Makes my life easier since I qualified that. All right. Is there any tips or tricks on time management and task organization?
So, and there's a lot that goes with that. I would say find a time management system that works for you. The challenge is that sometimes SEs tend to err on, in the spectrum of SEs, there are the ones who are more salesy or the ones who are more technical, and anywhere in that spectrum, certain time management techniques or systems work better. I just think that try as many as you can and find the one that works for you. For me, I now rely heavily on Google for everything, like reminders and tasks and things. And so, of course, the challenge is having the discipline to actually put things in Google so that they can remind you later. So I think it's really, if you're trying to adapt a time management system and it doesn't work, get rid of it and find something that does, because there's plenty out there.
Well, I think the biggest tip that you mentioned right there is discipline. None of the time management techniques will work if you don't have the discipline to actually use it.
Well, there you go. And
Yeah.
if I could teach you that, then I would be making millions of dollars teaching that.
You just
So,
did.
There you go. Well, there you go.
But
Come,
it was for free.
read my book, come to my seminar, and we'll all be good. So,
Okay. I had a question that I wanted to replace the last one. Okay, yeah. So you mentioned some SEs are salesy, some SEs are technical,
Mhm.
or at least a combination of both.
Sure.
Let's say your strength is being a little bit more salesy than technical. Should you work to get better on your strength, or should you work to get better on your weaknesses?
So this is the classic sales or strength finder discussion. I would say the younger you are, the more you should focus on trying to shore up the one you're deficient in. Actually, I think that's a good case for both. I think that I think that in general, and I may be wrong in this, but I feel like that the older you get, the more salesy you become. And it's not because you're necessarily dislike technology, but the pace at which technology is changing now is exponential. And so being able to stay current is difficult, if nothing else, from a time perspective. So I think that in general, you really do want to focus on your strength. If you're more salesy, and obviously, like I said, it's a spectrum, right? I mean, you're kind of a variance one way or the other, and even some days you may be more salesy than technical, or maybe more salesy and technical, depending on the opportunity you're involved in. But I would say that, in general, from a sales engineer perspective, just don't spend a lot of time trying to shore up the thing you're not good at. Find the ways to work around that, or mitigate that, or get by, right? Because the thing is, on a sales engineering team, you're going to have a variety of people with different skill sets, and they're all valuable, and they can all be used. I think that the younger you are, the more you should try to shore up the other thing that's lacking, and the older you are, you should just make sure that you can at least be credible or bring the right person in if necessary.
Is there an age limit that you would say for younger or older?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question, because I mean, we could get into the whole topic of age discrimination in the technology industry for sure. I don't know if the age, I don't think there's an exact number. I think it's more about just competency level and preference.
So basically, if you feel old, then you're old.
Well, yeah, that's what I keep telling myself. I'm about to turn 50, so I keep telling myself that. But,
okay, you don't look a day older than 21.
Thank you kindly.
Or 51. Sorry, I had to ruin it.
No worries.
All right, on this terrible disappointment, I guess we'll end the show today. Thanks a lot, Neil, for your time. I appreciate it, and I enjoyed talking to you now and previously when we had that short chat. So,
thanks for talking to me, Ramsey, and thanks for what you're doing. I appreciate your effort to put out this podcast and to rally the sales engineering community. I think there should be a lot more of this. And like I said, I appreciate you putting yourself out there and doing this. Even if you said it was for selfish reasons, but you know what? That's okay, because everybody's benefiting from it, I think.
Well, that's my hope, and I appreciate the kind words. Thank you, Neil.
All right. Well, that was it. I've had a beautiful conversation with Neil, and I don't know why I chose the word beautiful, but I'm sick. I'm going to use that as an excuse for everything today. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for listening. Can you do me a favor and just take one thing that you enjoyed about the show, get on the show notes, which is at wetheSalesEngineers.com/show33, and put in the comments what you enjoyed about this show. I can't be the only person who enjoyed it, so at least I hope this was beneficial to everybody. So do me that favor, and I just want to have a conversation with as many people as possible, because this is fun. Like, talking about sales engineering is fun. I don't know if it should be fun, but it is for me, at least. So do me that favor. All the books that he mentioned, I actually did find Selling Air, which I hope that's the right book. I'm sure Neil will tell me if it's the wrong one. Link to it is on the show notes. So show 33. And that's pretty much it for me. We had a successful webinar last weekend, so that was fun. For like people aspiring to be sales engineers. For this month's podcast webinar, it will be on the 22nd of December, and actually Adam O'Brien, my guest from the last podcast, is going to be the one presenting. I will not be presenting anything. He'll be taking the lead on that. We're just trying to help as many people in the SE community. He agreed to do it, so thank you for that, Adam, as well. So, that's it for me. I got nothing else to say. I appreciate you guys being here. Thank you, and I will see you on the next show. With that, this is Ramsey signing off.